That morning felt like any other until I walked into the courtroom wearing my hospital scrubs. I was there to support a patient's family during a custody hearing, never expecting to become the center of attention. The judge, an older white man with cold eyes, sneered when he saw me. He asked condescendingly if I thought I was in a hospital, not a courtroom. Then, right in front of everyone, he launched into a humiliating rant, mocking my uniform, questioning my education, and insinuating that someone like me didn't belong in such a civilized setting. I stood frozen, rage burning beneath my skin, memories of my ancestors' struggles flashing through my mind. But I didn't lash out. I stood tall, spoke calmly, and what happened after changed the course of not just that courtroom, but my entire life. What started as a moment of racism became a story of resilience, legal redemption, unexpected alliances, and ultimately, a revelation about my family's hidden legacy that turned everything I knew on its head. My name is Danielle Harper, and I've been a registered nurse for 14 years. I've held the hands of the dying, delivered babies in elevators, stitched up broken children after senseless violence, and stayed past countless shifts because someone needed comfort. In Scrubs, I've lived my truth that care has no color, dignity knows no class, and service is sacred. But on that one morning in a courtroom, of all places, everything I stood for was challenged. Not by a patient, not by bureaucracy, but by a man in a robe who thought my uniform made me less. It was a Tuesday. Overcast skies, drizzle tapping against my windshield as I pulled into the county courthouse parking lot. I wasn't even supposed to be there. I had picked up an extra night shift in the ER and was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep. But when I heard Mrs. Latrice Morrow's hearing was scheduled for the morning, I knew I couldn't just walk away. Her son, Jamal, had been admitted 3 times in 2 months, asthma, pneumonia, bruises he wouldn't talk about. The state was involved now, and I'd promised her I'd show up. So I did. In scrubs. No makeup. No sleep. Just heart. The courtroom was mostly empty when I slipped into the back row. A few attorneys chatted quietly. A social worker smiled when she saw me. Mrs. Morrow turned in her seat, her eyes swelling with relief. I nodded gently. We were here. She wasn't alone. But then the doors opened, and with them came silence. Judge Raymond Claiborne entered like a storm in slow motion. Tall, heavyset, and scowling beneath bushy white eyebrows, he gave the room a once-over before sinking into his chair like he owned the air we breathed. It was his glare that found me. He squinted, leaned forward, then straightened up. You, he said, pointing a thick finger in my direction. Are you lost, young lady? I blinked, unsure if he was speaking to me. You, the one dressed for a surgery ward, he continued, his voice loud and icy. This is a courtroom, not a hospital. A few people turned. I heard someone stifle a chuckle. I stood up slowly. Your Honor, I'm here as a support witness for Mrs. Morrow. I'm a nurse at Mercy General. Jamal, her son, has been under my care several times. He leaned back in his chair, the sneer never leaving his face. So, you couldn't even find time to dress appropriately for court? You thought scrubs were acceptable attire in a place of law and order? I swallowed hard. With respect, Your Honor, I came straight from a night shift to be here. Well, he said with a mocking grin, some people think uniforms make them important. But let me remind you, no matter what you wear, in here, you are just a guest. Try to remember that. The room was quiet. I could feel the heat in my face, the sting of shame crawling up my spine. I hadn't expected applause or even gratitude, but I didn't expect humiliation either. My skin felt too tight for my body, the weight of every generational slight pressing into my chest. I could have spoken up. Could have lashed out. Instead, I lowered my eyes and sat back down. But inside, something cracked. Not broken, no, it was the kind of crack that lets in light. Mrs. Morrow reached back and touched my hand. Her grip was trembling. I squeezed it gently. I'm okay, I whispered, even though I wasn't. After the hearing ended, a short continuation, another delay in justice, I stood in the hallway, trying to breathe. Trying to erase the echo of the judge's voice. But what happened next changed the tone entirely. A young woman walked up to me. I thought she was a clerk or paralegal, but when she spoke, her words sent chills down my spine. "I'm sorry for what he said in there. You don't deserve that. And I think you should know something about Judge Claiborne." I stared at her, confused. She leaned in closer and whispered, "He's done this before. But not everyone stays quiet. You didn't react, but maybe you should respond." And just like that, the story I thought I was part of, just a nurse supporting a mother, became something bigger. Something deeper. Something dangerous. Something powerful. I didn't sleep much that night. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, Judge Claiborne's cold smirk, his condescending tone, the way he looked at me like I didn't belong. Like my presence defiled the sanctity of his courtroom. But what haunted me more was the girl's words outside the courtroom. "He's done this before." What did that mean? Who else had he done this to? And why was no one talking about it? I showed up to my next shift with heavy limbs and a racing heart. But something had shifted inside me. I couldn't just let this go. I couldn't pretend it didn't matter, not when so many women like me, walk into rooms every day and are met with judgment instead of respect. I knew the pain of it too well. My grandmother used to say, "Silence is the wound that festers." I wasn't going to stay silent. That evening, after checking on my patients and finishing my charting, I went to the nurse's break room and opened my laptop. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I started with the judge's name, Raymond Claiborne. County court judge for over 20 years. Decorated. Respected. Conservative. Little mention of controversy, but my gut told me the cracks were there. It didn't take long to find the blog. It was buried deep, not listed in any major searches. Written by a woman named Adrienne Belkin, a paralegal who had once worked in the courthouse. Her tone was cautious, careful, but in between the lines, I could see the truth trying to fight its way out. She spoke of a culture of subtle contempt, of women of color being held to a different standard, of interns who'd mysteriously been reassigned after raising complaints. It wasn't an expose, it was a cry for someone braver to pick up the thread. I bookmarked the site and searched her name. I found her on LinkedIn and took a chance. I sent a short message, introducing myself, explaining what had happened in court. I didn't expect a response right away. But she replied within an hour. Her message read, "I remember you. You treated my mother 2 years ago when she had pneumonia. I never forgot your kindness. Yes, Claiborne humiliated me in front of a courtroom once, reduced me to tears. I tried to report it, but HR buried it. You're not alone. If you want to talk, I'm here." Tears welled in my eyes. Of all people, her mother had been one of mine. The connection felt like fate, or maybe justice was finally finding its voice. The next day, I called Adrienne. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but it carried strength beneath the fear. She told me stories of whispered insults, career sabotage, and how she was once told by a clerk, "If you want to survive here, keep your head down." But I wasn't built for bowing my head. "What if we gather more stories?" I asked her. "What if we show them he's not untouchable?" There was a pause. Then, softly, "Then maybe it's time." We started quietly. We reached out to former clerks, legal aides, even defense attorneys who had worked in his court. A few didn't respond. Some were afraid. But others, women, especially Black and Latina women, began to speak. I set up an encrypted email, created a private list of accounts and testimonies. Every story was a piece of a puzzle I hadn't expected to put together. Each one cracked the mask Judge Claiborne wore in public. One woman, Maria, said he'd once told her she looked more like someone's cleaning lady than a courtroom interpreter. Another, a young Black law student, recalled him rejecting her internship with the words, "We don't need diversity hires to meet a quota." My stomach turned with every word. But I also felt something else blooming inside me, a fire. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. At night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by notes and recordings, the weight of so many women's pain pressing down on me. I thought of my mother, who cleaned homes her whole life so I could wear scrubs instead of an apron. I thought of my daughter, Layla, who was 10 and fierce and too young to know that the world could look at her and decide she was less than. Not if I had anything to say about it. I reached out to a journalist I knew from the hospital charity events. Her name was Kimberly Sloan, and she was fearless. When I told her what we had, the testimonies, the patterns, the ignored complaints, her voice sharpened. "I'll run the story," she said. "But you need to go on record. If you want people to believe it, they need to see your face." I hesitated. Going public meant opening myself to judgment, to backlash, to being picked apart in the media. I could lose my job. Be called bitter, dramatic, even ungrateful. But when I looked in the mirror that night, I saw more than a nurse. I saw a woman who had spent years healing others and now had to heal something far more broken than anybody: the truth. "I'll do it," I told her the next morning. "Tell my story. And tell theirs too." What none of us knew then was just how far this would go and how many lives it would touch, including my own. 2 weeks later, I walked into the studio for the interview that would change everything. The lights were warm, the cameras intimidating, and my heart threatened to pound out of my chest. Kimberly Sloan greeted me with a hug, not the formal kind, but the real kind, the kind women give when they know you're about to step into the storm and stand alone. "You ready, Danielle?" she asked. I wasn't. But I nodded. The interview lasted just under an hour. Kimberly asked thoughtful, piercing questions, not just about the day in court, but about my career, my calling, and what it felt like to be reduced to a girl in scrubs in a room of supposed justice. I spoke with trembling hands but steady eyes. I spoke of my patients, of how my uniform wasn't just fabric, it was a badge of purpose. I spoke of the humiliation, the years of invisible dismissals, the way the judge's words echoed a history we weren't supposed to talk about anymore. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I read one of the testimonies. A short, anonymous one from a young black court reporter who'd written. He told me to tie my hair back because it was too wild for court. He said my natural curls were distracting. I straightened it the next day. I've never worn it natural since. I choked on the last sentence. When the interview aired 3 days later, I was at work, passing meds and checking vitals. I had almost forgotten what day it was until my phone started vibrating non-stop. Texts from friends. Emails. Even messages from strangers. By the time my shift ended, the story had over 400,000 views online. It was being shared on social media under the hashtag #ScrubsAndDignity. I clicked on it, trembling. Post after post showed nurses, aides, EMTs, and caregivers sharing their own stories of being dismissed, disrespected, or humiliated for how they looked, especially women of color. Some wore scrubs in their selfies with captions like, "This uniform saved lives today. Sorry if that's not courtroom chic. You see fabric. I see honor." #ScrubsAndDignity isn't just a hashtag, it's who we are. I couldn't breathe. By the end of the week, the network released an extended segment featuring more women who came forward with their experiences under Judge Claiborne's courtroom. Adrienne, the paralegal who first spoke to me, finally went on camera. So did Maria. And a retired black attorney named Lorraine Weaver, who recalled being called aggressive in Claiborne's courtroom for simply objecting, while her white male counterparts were praised for commanding presence. The tide was turning. And then, something happened I never expected. The hospital board called me in. For a moment, my heart dropped. I thought I was in trouble, maybe for speaking publicly, maybe for using the hospital's name. But when I walked into that room, every member of the board stood up and applauded. "Danielle," the director said, "you've reminded this community what a nurse truly stands for. We are proud to have you as our own." Tears fell freely then. Not because I needed the recognition, but because for once, my voice had not just been heard, it had echoed. Later that night, while making tea in my kitchen, Layla came in with her tablet. "Mom," she said, her eyes wide, "you're on TikTok." I laughed. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? She showed me the video, a clip from my interview, stitched with comments from young girls, aspiring nurses, even law students. One said, "When I grow up, I want to be like Nurse Danielle." My throat tightened. I sat on the kitchen floor and pulled Layla into my lap. "You can be anything you want," I whispered into her curls. "Just never let anyone tell you your worth comes from what you wear or the color of your skin." As I rocked her gently, the world outside continued to shift. But Judge Claiborne was silent. No statements. No denials. No apologies. Until one morning, 3 weeks after the story broke, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Official county seal. My name printed neatly. Inside was a subpoena. Judge Raymond Claiborne was being investigated for judicial misconduct. And I had been called as the primary witness. The moment I saw the subpoena, my hands trembled. It wasn't just a letter, it was a turning point. A symbol that the world, even if slowly and reluctantly, had heard us. That the whispers that once went ignored had finally become loud enough to reach the halls of justice. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. Testifying in front of the very system that had tried to belittle me, that wasn't something I had ever imagined for myself. I was a nurse. I healed people. Quietly. Steadily. I didn't seek attention, and I certainly wasn't someone who made waves. And yet, there I was, standing in front of the mirror days before the hearing, rehearsing my testimony. I'd chosen not to wear scrubs that day, not out of fear, but strategy. I wore a deep navy suit, clean lines, nothing flashy. My curls were soft around my face, natural, unapologetic. I looked like myself, but also like someone they'd be forced to take seriously. My lawyer, a fierce black woman named Attorney Carla Monroe, held my hand just before we entered the room. "He'll try to rattle you," she whispered. "Stay centered. You've already won by standing here." I nodded, but my heart pounded against my ribs like a drum in a storm. The hearing room was smaller than a courtroom, but no less intimidating. A panel of judicial review officers sat at the head. Judge Claiborne sat at a table, flanked by his attorney. He looked older somehow, grayer. But his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, hadn't changed. I refused to flinch. When I was called to testify, I walked to the front, placed my hand on the Bible, and took my oath. My voice didn't shake. Not once. I told them everything. About that day in court. About his words. About how he made me feel like a criminal for being a nurse. For being black. For existing. Then, I told them about the others, the women whose voices I carried in my heart like sacred stories. I read parts of their statements aloud, with their permission, each one landing in the room like a thunderclap. There was silence when I finished. And then, Claiborne's attorney stood. He tried to spin the narrative. Accused me of exaggeration. Of having personal bias. Suggested I was using this for social media fame. The moment he said that, I felt heat rise up my neck, but I stayed still, calm. Carla stood up then, her voice clear and firm. "What kind of fame do you think a black woman gets for speaking out against a white judge?" she asked him. "Because what I see here is courage, not clout." The room fell quiet again. Then, for the first time, Judge Claiborne spoke. His voice was lower than I remembered, more restrained. "I've served this court with integrity for over 2 decades, he began. "If my words were misunderstood, I regret that. But I never intended to offend. It was the closest thing to an apology he'd ever give, but it wasn't enough. Because we hadn't misunderstood him. He had underestimated us." After the hearing, I walked outside into a bright, clear day. A crowd had gathered, nurses in scrubs, law students, reporters, and community members. Some held signs. "Respect has no dress code. Scrubs are sacred. We stand with Danielle." Tears slipped down my cheeks. I had never felt so seen. That evening, I returned home to find a surprise waiting for me. My front porch was filled with flowers. Dozens of bouquets, roses, lilies, sunflowers. Notes tucked inside them with messages like, "Thank you for speaking for those of us who couldn't. You gave me the strength to report my boss today. My daughter wants to be a nurse because of you." And then, a single envelope. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "You may not wear a robe, but you brought more justice into that courtroom than any judge I've seen in 30 years. I stood there in the golden light of dusk, surrounded by flowers and hope, and for the first time in a long while, I felt whole. But the journey wasn't over. Because the panel's decision hadn't been announced yet. And what they would decide in the coming weeks would not only affect Judge Claiborne's career, but set a precedent for how our voices would be heard in every courtroom from that day forward. The days that followed were filled with both tension and hope. Every headline carried a variation of my name. Nurse testifies against judge in landmark misconduct case. Can a uniform be a weapon for change? Justice on trial. But beneath the media noise, I was still Danielle, mother, nurse, woman who cried quietly when the dishes piled up and the world felt too heavy. I went back to work, needing the grounding presence of my patients. My scrubs became more than just my uniform again, they became a quiet act of resistance. Every shift, I walked into that hospital with my head high, and I wore my scrubs like armor. And slowly, life started feeling normal again until the day the letter came. It was a formal notice. The Judicial Review Panel had reached a decision. The hearing would be public. I was invited to attend. I clutched the envelope, unable to breathe for a moment. When the day arrived, the room was packed. TV cameras lined the back. Journalists scribbled in notepads. I sat in the second row, behind Carla, with Layla beside me. She held my hand tightly, too tightly for a 12-year-old, but I didn't let go. Judge Claiborne sat to the left, dressed in his signature black robe, but looking smaller somehow. Thinner. Tired. The head of the panel, an older black man named Justice Bernard Hughes, stood and read the findings. The panel finds that Judge Raymond Claiborne's conduct on the date in question violated the Code of Judicial Ethics in both tone and substance. His behavior reflected bias, contributed to a hostile courtroom environment, and perpetuated harmful stereotypes against a professional woman of color. My breath caught. This panel recommends the immediate suspension of Judge Claiborne from all judicial duties pending further review and mandatory retraining. Additionally, we recommend a formal letter of apology be issued to Nurse Danielle Thomas and others affected by similar conduct in his courtroom. The room went silent, then erupted into gasps. I didn't cry. Not then. Not yet. I just sat there, absorbing the weight of what had happened. Justice had spoken. And it had used my name. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by a sea of faces. Some were familiar: Adrienne, Maria, Carla. Some were strangers. But every single person looked at me with gratitude. A young man stepped forward. I'm in law school, he said. I wasn't sure I could survive the system. But now I know I have to change it. I hugged him, overwhelmed. Later that night, Layla and I curled up on the couch. She rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "You didn't just stand up for yourself, Mom. You stood up for all of us." And that's when I finally cried. Not tears of fear or frustration, but of release. Of pride. In the following weeks, something remarkable began happening across the country. Hospitals started campaigns called #ScrubPride, honoring frontline workers from diverse backgrounds. Court systems across 3 states initiated mandatory bias training for judges and court staff. I was asked to speak at a national nursing conference, and for the first time, I said yes. But perhaps the most touching moment came when I visited my old high school. I'd been invited to speak to a group of seniors. Most were young black and brown girls, wide-eyed and curious. One raised her hand and asked, "Weren't you scared to speak up?" I smiled, remembering every tear, every doubt, every long night. "Yes," I said. But I was more scared of what would happen if I stayed silent. That day, I wore my scrubs on purpose. Not to prove anything. But because I could. Because finally, I had made peace with every part of me that had once been questioned. Because now, the world saw what I had always known. A black woman in scrubs is not invisible. She is undeniable. Months passed, but the fire sparked that day in the courtroom didn't die out. It spread, quietly at first, then louder, like a wave refusing to be ignored. It started with messages from nurses around the country: Black, Latina, Asian, Indigenous. Many shared how they'd been stared at, second-guessed, or even dismissed while in their uniforms. One woman wrote, "I stopped wearing my scrubs in court because I didn't want to be judged before I even opened my mouth. You changed that for me." Those words stayed with me. Then came the interviews. CNN, NPR, even a write-up in The Atlantic. They didn't just want to talk about what had happened to me, but about what it meant for so many others. I wasn't just a nurse anymore. I had become a symbol. A reluctant one, but one I couldn't run from. Carla and I started an initiative called Voices in Scrubs, a non-profit dedicated to giving healthcare professionals a platform to speak out against systemic bias. We held town halls, created an online resource hub, and offered legal guidance to those navigating discrimination. I wasn't trained for any of this. I had always been more comfortable with a stethoscope than a spotlight. But somehow, my purpose had grown. And so had the impact. A judge in Illinois was quietly reassigned after a nurse filed a complaint inspired by my case. A courthouse in Georgia updated their dress code policies, explicitly stating that medical uniforms were allowed and respected. Even the American Bar Association issued a new statement encouraging respectful engagement with healthcare professionals participating in civic duties. It was surreal. But not everything was smooth. There were critics, 2 commentators who called me dramatic. Trolls who said I weaponized race. A few even questioned my motives, asking why I was still holding on to the incident. And honestly, those moments stung deeply. There were nights I sat at the edge of my bed, rereading hate mail with shaking hands, wondering if I'd made a mistake by ever speaking up. I worried about Layla, how all of this might affect her, how I could protect her from the ugliness that crept through the internet. But then she'd say something small but powerful. Like the night she walked in wearing her toy stethoscope and said, "I want to help people just like you do, Mommy. Even the ones who don't know they need it." That kept me going. One morning, as I was preparing for a panel discussion in Washington, D.C., I received an unexpected letter. It was from Judge Claiborne. Typed, signed, and hand-delivered. Ms. Thomas. Time has offered me reflection. While my words were not intended to harm, I now understand they did. And for that, I am deeply sorry. I cannot undo the past, but I am committed to doing better. I hope this letter reaches you not just as an apology, but as an acknowledgement of your strength. You held me accountable. And in doing so, you held a mirror up to the system we both serve. I read it twice. Then again. It wasn't everything, but it was something. I didn't respond. Not yet. Maybe I never would. But I folded the letter and tucked it into a small wooden box that I keep in my closet, where I store things that matter. Not just good things, but things that shaped me. Because that letter, in its own way, was a piece of a puzzle I never asked to build, but one I now felt responsible for finishing. The next time I wore scrubs to a courthouse, I wasn't testifying. I was giving a keynote speech at a legal reform summit. Standing behind the podium, I looked out at rows of lawmakers, judges, nurses, students. And I told them the story. Not just of a moment in a courtroom, but of everything it awakened. I ended with this. Respect isn't worn on a robe or a suit. It's carried in how we treat one another. And when we start to recognize dignity in all forms, even in scrubs, we build a justice system worthy of its name. The applause was long. And heartfelt. But what mattered most was the look on the face of a young black nurse in the third row, her arms crossed over her scrub top, her eyes glistening. Because she knew this fight had always been bigger than me. And it still wasn't over. A full year had passed since the courtroom incident that turned my world upside down. But it was never really just about that one day. It was about a lifetime of quiet resistance. A lifetime of walking into rooms where people assumed I didn't belong and proving otherwise. In that year, everything changed. Layla grew taller, more outspoken. She started a student council initiative at her school called Voices Matter, where students could safely share their experiences with discrimination, bullying, or bias. Watching her speak confidently in front of her classmates, I saw a new generation forming, braver, louder, freer. Carla and I expanded Voices in Scrubs beyond what we imagined. It became a national organization, offering mentorship to young nursing students, legal workshops, and community healing sessions for healthcare workers traumatized by systemic injustice. But some of the most powerful moments didn't happen on stage, or in headlines. They happened in the quiet. Like the day a janitor at the hospital pulled me aside and said, "I've worked here 22 years, Miss Danielle. Never seen someone speak for folks like us the way you did. Or when I received a letter from the mother of a black nursing student who wrote, "My daughter almost quit nursing school after a professor told her she'd never make it in the real world with her attitude. Then she watched your story. And now she's graduating with honors." That letter stayed on my fridge for months. Not every day was easy. The weight of being seen as a symbol can grow heavy. There were moments I longed to return to anonymity, to be just a nurse again, Danielle again, not a headline or a voice for justice. But those feelings never lasted long. Because I had tasted what it felt like to make change, not the kind you read about, but the kind you live. Underscore 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 underscore. One afternoon, I was invited back to the very same courthouse where it all began. Not for a trial. For a ceremony. The city was honoring individuals who had made a significant impact on civic life and justice reform. I was one of the honorees. When I walked into the building, I noticed something different. The guards smiled, not a forced smile, but one that reached their eyes. The walls were decorated with portraits of city heroes, activists, educators, healthcare workers. And in one frame, hung a photograph from the day of my testimony. I stood in the witness box, hand on my heart, scrubs crisp and proud. I stood before a small crowd as the mayor handed me a plaque. But the words on it took my breath away. Danielle Thomas, for wearing her scrubs with honor, and dismantling injustice with grace. It wasn't the award that mattered. It was what it represented. That standing up had made a difference. That being visible had changed lives. That I, a black woman in scrubs, had redefined what power looked like. Underscore 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 underscore. That evening, back home, Layla and I sat on the porch watching the sunset. She looked at me and said, "Do you think one person can really change the world?" I paused. Then I smiled. "No," I said softly. "But one person can change someone's world. And that's where it starts." She leaned her head on my shoulder. The sky turned lavender and gold. And in that quiet moment, I knew. This story, my story, wasn't just about pain or justice. It was about transformation. About finding strength in silence. About rising from disrespect and turning it into purpose. And most of all, it was about legacy. Because long after the courtrooms fade, long after the headlines are forgotten, someone, somewhere, will remember the nurse who wore her scrubs into battle, and won something far greater than a verdict. She won change.